Hello, this is Georgina Rose. I go by Darling on the internet, and welcome back to my channel. This channel is a place where we discuss magic, mysticism, the occult, and everything on the fringes of esoterica. I'm your host, Georgina Rose, a Thelemite and ceremonial magician, and part-time esoteric content creator and part-time center of pestilence. In this video, in the first interview on this channel, though I did have a conversation a while back with another person, I'm having another Thelemite on. I came across his content through Thelemic Union, which is, if you're in the wider spiritual community, kind of like the Pathios for Thelema. I feel like that's probably the best comparison. But basically, it's a blogging news style site. And he came up with a term that I'd never encountered it. And it was essentially talking about one of the biggest problems that I see in Thelema and that is common in Thelema and that I personally have had my moments where I've slipped into it. So I thought it'd be really good to have him on to address it because while this channel does kind of focus on like educational content, I do tend to keep the commentary to my podcast. I thought this is a very pertinent issue, and since a lot of you guys I know are beginner practitioners, you're newer, you've not been around that long, I think it could be really helpful because this is one of those tendencies that I think is good to like snip out before it sort of goes too far.
My name is Jim. I go by Entelecheia online. I have a blog that I've been keeping for a few years called lapis-macurii.org, and I know that that's probably difficult to spell. ALAPIS-MERCURII.org. And yeah, I've been a practicing Thelemite for about 7 or 8 years now, and been interested in mysticism and religion and philosophy for far, far longer. But that's basically me. So.
Cool, and I'll have all his stuff linked below, so you guys can check the description box, check out what he creates and the original article. But first, let's talk about like what is Consensus Thelema, because I'd never seen this term before your article, and how would you sort of describe it for those who aren't familiar with it and are just sort of encountering this stuff for the first time?
So, as I said in the article, Consensus Thelema is difficult to define succinctly because it is largely an invisible or unacknowledged set of assumptions that lie behind a lot of contemporary Thelema. So, I think the current self-understanding of Thelema, or the self-understanding of Thelemites, is that it's very wide open, diverse, relativistic. Everybody's got their own interpretation of it. It's purely an individualistic pursuit. And what I was trying to point at with the article is that, contrary to those appearances, there's something actually very restrictive and dogmatic, that it can be kind of, that it's actually in a certain sense reductionistic, the way that it's being formulated. And that reductionism fails to do justice to some of Crowley's original insights, but more importantly than that, from my perspective, is that it fails to do justice to an entire spectrum of religious and mystical experience when we tend to frame things this way. So,
do you think this has been around for a while, or if it's a newer thing, where do you think it kind of began? Like, what sort of gave birth to this?
When I went back and looked at my article and looked at some of the quotes that I had put in there, they were all anonymous, but when I kind of went back and took stock of the quotes, probably about half of them were from like internet randos, basically just people on Reddit or in comment sections. But 3, possibly 4 of the individuals that I quoted were 9th degree of OTO. At least one of them was, well, 2 of them are pretty well recognized authors. So I think that a lot of it today is actually, it's possible that a lot of it today is being pushed out by a very small number of people, some of whom were there for the reestablishment of OTO in the 70s. Individuals who, I should say, I have a lot of respect for personally and do not in any want to impugn their character in any way. But I think you can trace some of this back to Thelema being reestablished in the 70s and the 80s, and it being kind of filtered down through a set of interests. 60s and 70s counterculture, the particular experience of counterculture on the West Coast in the United States in particular, I think was a big part of it. the people who restarted OTO they were basically individuals who carried forward the embers of Agape Lodge from Los Angeles in the 1930s and 40s. So, it's kind of a small number of people who did excellent, important, necessary work. Again, I don't mean to impugn them in any way, but you could see how it kind of went through a few different bottlenecks. First, it was the experience of OTO in California in the 30s and 40s, some of which Crowley was very critical of. And then it's a few individuals left over from that who carry forward these ideas to a new generation who are interpreting this stuff through the lens of 60s and 70s political and social and cultural interests, and then through the 80s as well. So I think it's gone through a few different filters. But I think ultimately, if you wanted to draw it back to its source, a lot of it comes from stuff in Crowley and stuff and how he was framing it sometimes. So I do think that the tendencies are there in Crowley's original work, but you have to add the caveat that it's one part of a whole, and that you have to, and that there is a more balanced view of Crowley than what is being emphasized right now, I think.
Yeah, so I think the biggest criticism that you got from this article, or at least that I noticed, because I did read through some of the Reddit threads, which I do not like r/Lima. I don't spend time on Reddit, so I was like, oh god, I'm going down into the trenches. I think the biggest thing that people were saying is that it was like Crowleyitism, Crowleyanity, whatever. What are your thoughts on that topic, and sort of like, is this just Crowleyitism, and why is it not?
My response to it is that Crowley had some very key, interesting insights. Ultimately, what I'm talking about does not really depend a lot on. It's trying to get away, actually, from this whole obsession about, well, what did Crowley say about something? Because you could pull out a Crowley quote for any number of things. And I even address this in the article. If you begin to really understand not just Thelema, but I think the spiritual insight and the spiritual impulse at the core of Thelema, it puts you in a position where it doesn't matter as much what Crowley necessarily said, because you have to step back and think about, well, was he justified in saying it? And that was one of the things that I mentioned in the article. Having these debates sometimes with Thelemites who will say things like, "Oh, well, Crowley made a remark in favor of something, therefore you're wrong." And it's like, well, I think if you understand this stuff on a deep enough level, you can turn around and say, well, maybe he wasn't really justified in saying that, because if you consider that he was working with these presuppositions over here, then that conclusion doesn't necessarily follow from that. So I would, from my perspective, it puts somebody in a stronger position to critique Crowley to do this. It's not really about getting back to some kind of original Crowley doctrine. It's really more about getting into the interior of Thelema and understanding how different ideas are connected with one another. So, I mean, let me give you another example to make this clearer. A lot of times when people criticize Crowley, it gets into this discussion about Crowley was problematic, or said something, from a political perspective that's problematic. And they're often criticizing Crowley on issues that I think are not necessarily at the core of what Thelema is. Like, for me, I think it's a much deeper criticism to criticize maybe the idea of pantheism, for instance, or the criticize the idea of whether we have a true self, or like whether that exists. These are ideas that people won't touch. And yet, I mean, to me, it seems that the kind of unthinking, unreflective adoption of, let's say moral relativism, or the idea of an authentic self or self-actualization, to me, that's a deeper, more entrenched dogma than just, worrying about what Crowley said about, I don't know, like the wand or something. Like, that's not as that's not as important to me. So yeah, kind of a long-winded answer, but I would say that the difference between what I'm doing and just Crowleyanity is that it's a deep it puts you in a position to do a deep critique of it, or a deep dive to really kind of understand it from the inside out, rather than just kind of picking at the edges of these little things of like, oh, Crowley said this thing about women over here, or had this or Crowley drank this brand of coffee. Do we have to worry about that as Thelemites? It's like, no.
Completely agreed. I feel like sometimes, like, first of all, I've tried to play the game of pulling Crowley quotes to defend random positions I think of to see if you can do it. A lot of the times you actually can. It's very amusing. What are some like examples of consensus thelema you see frequently, or like statements that you would say fall into the category?
So, what I tried to draw attention to in the article, I kind of stated at the outset of the article that I was going to do this sort of like off the hip kind of shotgun blast to just sort of hit it, because I stressed over this article for a while because I couldn't really figure out like what's the center of this, like how do I organize this article. And for me, the key insight that I had was this idea of the thought terminating cliche, which is an idea that I sort of harp on a lot in the article. And the thought terminating cliche is like a sound bite. It's a way of taking a complex problem or a complex question and just reducing it down to a very quick, very simple idea that eliminates all of the complexity and shuts down the possibility of further questioning and further dialogue. And it's an anti-intellectual move, but it's also a strategy that's very frequent when people have cognitive dissonance, or they just don't want to acknowledge contradictions. So what I tried to emphasize in the article is that it's not really so much about any particular beliefs. Like I said, some of those beliefs that I mentioned in the article are things that I believe to a certain extent. Like, yes, truth is relative to a certain degree, and we shouldn't establish, like, we should be careful about establishing dogmas. We should be careful about being arbitrary. But when you're in a debate with somebody and you're having some disagreement, let's say, about I don't know, the significance of the chakras and Liber Reguli or something like that, and maybe you've done more research on the issue than the person you're talking to has, and they get frustrated and they just kind of at some point counter with, well, just interpret it as you will. It's just up to each person to interpret it. That's a thought terminating cliche. That's pulling out of the issue and basically switching tracks and saying, just kind of falling back on this idea, well, everybody has their perspective. So that would be an example of a thought terminating cliche. Another one that I used in the article was there were two people having a debate about like, I think, existential framings of Thelema, and somebody posed, I didn't think it was a particularly pointed or harsh question, but the other person responds and says, well, I choose to inhabit a universe where my theory is right. And I was like, holy shit, wouldn't it be great if you could just do that all the time? Wow, that's really convenient. And so that's a thought terminating cliche. It's, often people are changing, they're changing the subject from, we're discussing this issue over here, and then suddenly it becomes about my preference or my right to interpret something as I will. That's not really the point. We all have the right to interpret things as we will, but you don't want to be arbitrary. That's really what I'm trying to point out here. Another one that I pointed out in the article, that's a huge issue, and this is probably the hardest part of the article to write, was on this idea of enchanted centrism, which is this kind of spiritualization of our freedom of choice around things. One of the points that I'm trying to make in the article is that um, I consider myself friendly towards, secularism. I'm a very left-leaning liberal person, but I think it's dangerous to treat ourselves as though we are somehow divine just for exercising freedom of choice, or just for having, the ability to self-actualize in our careers or in our friendships or in our hobbies. Like, I think those are very, very positive things, but I think that it's dangerous when you start to make that the focal point of our divinity. Because Crowley would say that those are aspects of the ego that you're elevating up to the level of godhood. And I would say from the other side of it, you're taking a particular, I don't know, let's say privileged lifestyle that's enjoyed by a certain class of people in the United States at a certain time of history and saying that, this is our spirit, hanging it up in heaven as though it's like, a constellation up in the sky.
Do you feel like this impacts the community or like the individual more, or if it sort of impacts both negatively? Like, do you think it can hold individuals back, or it just kind of messes up community discussion, or is it both or somewhere in between?
It's both. It creates a mushroom culture where people are kept in the dark and fed shit about it, and nobody develops any kind of insight into any of it, largely out of not because of the complexity of the ideas in it. That would be one thing, but I think largely driven out of fear, like a lot of dogma around it. I mean, look, you offering. I mean, the book of the law explained. I mean, if I saw a video that said general relativity explained, I wouldn't take it as like the once and for all explanation of general relativity. I would take it as an I would watch the video. I would not be in a position, not being a physicist, to necessarily critique it, but to offer an explanation of something doesn't mean that somebody else can't also offer an explanation of it. It doesn't stop them. It doesn't actually impede anybody if you do that. But as soon as you go and make a video like that, or as soon as anybody tries to offer an explanation, people act as though the very fact of you speaking and trying to offer an explanation is somehow an infringement upon their rights. And they won't tell you. I mean, sometimes I guess they'll tell you, don't make that video, or you shouldn't make that video. But more often than not, it's like this kind of like passive aggressive, like weird kind of like you can make the video, it's okay, but you should just feel horrible about yourself for doing it. It's like it's ridiculous. It's so ridiculous and manipulative. And it's like to imagine these people like, the law of the strong, this is our law, the joy of the world, back with but you should feel bad about explaining things. It's like, oh my God, that's just like that's real cognitive dissonance right there. So yeah, it's terrible. I think it's terrible for everybody to not, it's terrible for individuals because they remain at a very surface level with things, and they're not necessarily, they don't encounter the challenging aspects of it. Look, if anything challenging you run into in Thelema or any spiritual path, you're able to like, wave your hand and say, well, it's just a matter of, what you feel like doing with your life. I mean, imagine that. That's how can you ever be challenged? If you can't be
Yeah.
challenged, if you can't pick up something heavy and walk with it along a path, how are you going to get strong? How are you going to develop character? I think that's something that Crowley would personally be bothered by, and it's also something that I find bothersome, and I'm trying to break people out of a habit of.
So, how can we, as practitioners, as Thelemites, as occultist, whatever you are, viewer of the video, whatever label you prefer, how can we sort of avoid this trap and kind of stay out of the consensus Thelema territory? What advice would you give?
That's a question that I'm still in the process of thinking through, because it's a little bit hard to figure out exactly what the source of the issue is. So I would say that there are a few different ways I think that one could go with this. One way that I think doesn't work is, I guess one response to the sort of stuff that I'm talking about would be to say, well, just don't think about it. Just do the practices. It's like, and the problem with that is it's much harder to get away from concepts and theories than it seems. In fact, I think consensus dilemma results from a lack of reflection on presuppositions. I think that's in large part what's driving it, and that's part of the reason why certain people are resisting looking at it, because they've been doing it this way for so long that to turn back and look at it and question it now is a bit of a would be, could generate all kind of sunken cost fallacy issues at this point. I would say that, so I think that right there suggests a certain answer or a certain approach, which is stop and reflect and question some of it more. We have a prejudice in our culture, especially in the United States, toward pragmatism, keeping your head down, doing your work. What really matters is just doing the ritual, and that's important. Don't get me wrong. That's super important, but it's not enough, because you also need to have your heart and your soul and your mind in this as well. And so to begin with, I would start with questioning some of those assumptions. So for one example that we could of something that we could start to think about is, what's the difference between will and freedom of choice? Are those two things the same thing? So a lot of times it seems to me that, well, here's an example. So you're a solitary practitioner, so maybe you haven't noticed this, but I'm an OTO, and sometimes after an event or something, people will, there'll be an announcement of something, or like, it's like, we're going down the street to Applebee's to get some burgers. Come tag along if it's your will. And it's like, you think about it, it's like, ooh, let's stop and think about, can we start to disentangle, can we start to stop assuming that what we feel like doing is our will? Maybe that's not the case. Maybe there's, in a certain sense, another assumption that we can question is this idea that all dualisms are bad. Like, we can have dualisms about some things. You can have a dualism between what you're inclined to do and what you feel like doing and what your true will is. That tension, that polarity between where I tend to go and where I want to go as a human being, versus what is really my higher purpose, or what is the divine calling, or even what is the will of God. That's a productive dichotomy. We don't like that so much now, because we like to do what we feel. We don't like to be told not to do something. Permissiveness seems more empowering. That's something to question. Like, are we losing something if we're existing without that polarity?
So my final question is sort of a twofold question, because I am not good at brevity. The first part is, what advice would you give to new Thelemites just in general? And the second part is, what sort of resources or practices would you recommend for new people? Like, what would kind of be your recommendation for the people who are sort of entering the occult? They've got their foundations there and they're ready to start doing the thing and sort of embracing Thelema. What would be your advice for that?
So I usually just do not give practical advice to people, not because I think practice is unimportant, but because I feel like it's just so well covered at this point. The manual on practice is really Liber O, and I see so many ceremonial magic texts are really just elaborations on Liber O. Some of them are good, some of them are bad. It doesn't, from my perspective, but really, the basics are there. There's so many resources out there that are great. I meet so many people who are already really great practitioners. um, I mean, the only thing I ever really say to in terms of practice is, I say to people, find something that you love, find something that you really care about, and you have to love it, because you have to stick with it. It's gonna be hell in like 6 months, and you're gonna want to quit. And you have to be able to remember that love that you have for it, and just, like any difficult patch in a relationship, you go through it because you love the person. And that's what practice has to be like, because every person I know who has attained has had the one common factor, is that they just stuck with it in an almost like robotic kind of machine like fashion. So, if the ghost of Aleister Crowley himself walks into the room and tells you to take a break, tell him, no, I'm busy doing my pranayama. I'll catch up with you later. So that's the main sort of piece of practice, is just, find something that appeals to you, that really speaks to you, that calls you, and then, develop that dedication to it. In terms of people who are new to Thelema, what I would suggest to them is, so I've actually put together a website that has basic Crowley texts, and I think that people should get comfortable reading Crowley. The main complaint is that Crowley is so hard, and it's not that bad now. Like, you can look at it online, and you can highlight it and right click and search for the Google, and get translate the Latin parts and the French parts. It's not as bad as it used to be. And I've actually put together a site called Mouth of the Beast, which has it just has a collection. It has some of his commentaries on the Book of the Law. So commentaries on really sort of basic passages like every man and every woman is a star. I'm divided for love's sake. So just his thoughts on all of that and his kind of understanding of it. Doesn't mean that you have to stick with it your whole life, but just have a framework there. One of the most important passages I have in there is where he talks about the brothers of the left hand path, the Black brothers. That's a really he contrasts the left hand path with the saints, and I think that's such an important distinction to grasp because really the saints are sort of the epitome of Thelema, the realization where all of this is heading, and the left-hand path is really the opposite of that. So Crowley's really making it so stark about what the difference is. It's really the greatest contrast I think he draws between what the Thelemic path is about versus what it's not. And the really cool thing is that it turns out that what all the saints have in common is this incredible open heart and this incredible openness. They're not self-enclosed. They're not closed off from the world. It's not about me and my experience and my angel and my path and my will and my this, that, and the other thing. It's service to something. It's openness to it's being open by a power which is so much higher and so much grander than I think what people are used to looking at. And I think for new Thelemites to see that and to see what the summit of this thing looks like, because a lot of times a lot of introductory texts on Thelema are like Aleister Crowley was born in 1875 and here in the Book of the Law and here's how you do an LBRP, and it's like you don't get a sense of what it's really about. Like, why would you do this? It's like you're led down an alley of thinking that Thelema is just like ceremonial magic with more like libertinism or sex and drugs and it's like no, go up to the top of the mountain, go and take a look at that, because when you see what he thought that this was really about, I think a lot of people would be surprised and maybe they'll be horrified and be like, I don't want to do Thelema, and like that's fine too, because then you can leave that alone and go find something better. But it's so much bigger than people think. So I've got a few of those texts up on Mouth of the Beast. Whenever I sponsor people in OTO, I always send them to that and say, here, go read this. You don't have to read it all at once. But just take a little bit at a time and just get a sense of like why somebody would want to do this. I think that's really missing from a lot of contemporary Thelema is why would you want to do this? What's this really about?
So, where can we find you? Where can we see more of your stuff? What are your usernames, your platforms? How can people watching this video find more about you and more of your work?
Yeah, so I go by Entelecheia online, which is a hard to spell and hard to pronounce Greek word, and I have a hard to spell and hard to pronounce Latin named website, unfortunately. So maybe you could stick it in the comments. It's lapismercurii.org. And you can find most of my stuff off of there. I have a link to all of my articles on there. There are regular blog posts. I make cool, spooky philosophical diagrams, which I have up there. You can find the Mouth of the Beast website off of there. I also have some cool Kabbalistic color tools on there that I use constantly when I'm making spooky diagrams or doing rituals. It's really, really useful. And there are a few other things on there for like learning tarot and other things like that. So yeah, my Lapis Mercurii website is a really good place to find me. And you can also find me on Facebook. I have a page on there that I copy content to.
This has been the Dot Darling channel. If you want to support me, I'm Georgina Rose. I go under Dot Darling, DAAT. We are not a textile. It's a reference to Kabbalah that very few people get. You can find me on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, Odyssey, Telegram. I'm also on Patreon. You get all these videos about a week or two early. You get extra videos once a month and my ritual guides, amongst other things. And you can also listen to my podcast, Magnolias and Magic, which is a fully commentary podcast hosted with two other lovely creators and sometimes a third. That is on all major podcasting platforms. So thank you for watching. Please like, comment, subscribe, and ring the bell. And if you're subscribed for 93 days, you'll meet your holy guardian angel. I promise that actually works. Please do not send anyone on me for saying that. I thought everyone got it was a joke. Some people did not. Anyways, thank you guys for watching, and I will see you in another 2 weeks, because I do post here every other Thursday at noon. So thank you for watching and have a lovely day, night, afternoon, morning, wherever it is, whatever time it is, wherever you are.